morning and welcome to the Home Affairs Select Committee. This is our final session on our inquiry into the Fire and Rescue Service, and we're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Sabrina Cohen-Hatton. And what we want to find out from Dr. Cohen-Hatton as the Chief Fire Officer at West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service is about the cultural change within that service, but also to understand more generally about leadership in the Fire and Rescue Service and how that's held to account. So you're very welcome. I would just like to start us off actually seeking some advice from you, because I note that you are also the lead for the National Fire Chiefs Council on Improvement, the Improvement Committee.
Yes, that's correct.
Last week, there was a story running about chief fire officers and senior fire officers in Shropshire and around a WhatsApp group and messages that had been leaked. Some of the things that were in that WhatsApp group were referring to threats and wanting to kill female colleagues, and things like calling women lazy cows, fecking bint, useless. I would still like to kill her buddy. Messages like that. I think the committee has been quite taken with the evidence that we've heard throughout the inquiry about some of the cultural issues within the Fire and Rescue Service. And I think what struck me as being particularly interesting was those people involved in those exchanges are still in place. They haven't been suspended by Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service. Are you surprised by that?
What I would say first of all is that we were all really shocked to read the news report. It made incredibly difficult reading. What I would also say is due process has to go through within that service, so it would be inappropriate for me to comment directly on another colleague. But what I would say is that it's not appropriate for colleagues to be talking about one another in that way, and it was incredibly difficult to watch. I think the other point that's important to recognise is that in the Fire and Rescue Service we're a microcosm of wider society, and we still have huge issues, I think, with systemic and structural inequalities in wider society. I've also experienced some incredibly challenging conversations and language from other colleagues throughout my career. I've served for 23 years now. But I've also had some incredible support from within the Fire and Rescue Service. I would say I experienced some worse behaviour from people outside of the Fire and Rescue Service. And if I might just give you an example of that, there are comments that are underneath news articles about me that don't relate to my position in the Fire and Rescue Service. They're not articles about gender equality in any way, but the language and the abuse in them is incredibly gendered, and it's intended to humiliate and degrade. So I think, abuse that people get who are different in some way to the majority of people in a workplace when you're from an underrepresented group, I would argue comes from all sections of society as well. It's certainly not just within the service. Recognising that, we absolutely have to do better within the service. We have to be better than that. But the pushback that we have is that we have to be better than that against that wider perspective as well.
Can I just ask you, just returning to my original question about those WhatsApp exchanges, if firefighters in your Fire and Rescue Service were exchanging those messages and you found out about it, would those firefighters, would they be suspended while an investigation was taking place?
They would absolutely be subject to a disciplinary investigation. Whenever we suspend somebody, we do a risk assessment, and we take into account a number of factors within that risk assessment. The risk of them remaining in position, the risk to their own mental health as well from suspending them, the risk of others' mental health from not suspending them. So it's really difficult to give a cut and dry yes or no on the face of those things without having gone through that due process and that risk assessment as well. But what I would say with certainty that if that were to have happened in my service, then there would absolutely be a disciplinary investigation that would be happening as a result.
Right. It seems to me that leadership is so important. That's one of the key things that we found. Setting the tone, setting the culture. And it just strikes me, if you've got the leaders of an organisation exchanging messages in the way that those were being exchanged, that's of huge concern. And I think I am very surprised that there hasn't been a suspension at this point to carry out that investigation. But thank you very much for your thoughts on that. I'm going to move to Tim Lawton now.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Cohen-Hatton, you've been doing quite a turnaround job in West Sussex, and I think many of the things you found there are typical of some of the cultural problems that are now coming out increasingly in the fire service, and we've seen from some of the evidence, confidential and direct, which has been quite shocking. Do you want to just give an account of some of the problems you found and why you so far seem to be turning things around quite rapidly, and what's behind that?
Absolutely. I joined West Sussex back in 2019 following a very difficult inspection report. For comparison, out of that inspection report, we were probably the second worst performing fire and rescue service in the country. Out of 10 causes of concern that the HMIC FRS had given out nationally, 4 of them were in West Sussex. 2 of them had implications for public safety and 2 of them related to people and culture. So we were starting from a really challenging position. And when I landed in that service, I was met with a workforce of people who had frankly not been set up to succeed. They'd had an incredibly difficult time. There were excessive cuts that had happened previously. We had a letter from the Minister that had recognised that and advised us to review the resources that we had against our statutory functions. But that meant that we had a workforce who had been desperately trying to do things against a backdrop in which they weren't able to succeed. And then they had their efforts replayed back to them in language such as inadequate, and understandably so, because people had an incredibly difficult time in that service. So when I landed in the service, there were a number of things that needed to happen. Absolutely, first and foremost, were fixing those areas that had implications for public safety. But that was against a backdrop of needing to improve the culture. There were people who'd experienced bullying. There are people who had accepted a culture where the behaviours weren't aligned with the values of the service. And actually, people shouldn't have to go into a workplace and have that kind of experience. Being a firefighter is an incredible privilege because you're trusted by people to know what to do when they're having the worst day that they've ever had. As a leader, it's really important to give people the kind of environment that they need to succeed, to be able to do those really difficult things that we ask. So in terms of what we did, there was a huge aspect of breaking down the service into its component parts and putting it back together again so that it worked. To change the culture, people have to have a different experience. Culture is not set by a strategy that you write on a piece of paper. Culture is set by the experiences that people have every single day and the belief of the day that they're likely to have when they come into work. So we knew that we had to change some of the machinery that sat within the service to be able to give people different experiences. People felt like the promotion processes weren't fair, so we had to completely revamp the promotion processes so that they were fair and transparent. We had to review the grievance process and the disciplinary processes to make sure that they were fair and transparent. We had to upskill people so that they could conduct investigations more appropriately, better and more fairly. So there was a huge amount in the machinery. You can't hinge it on just heroic leadership. It's not one person says something that other people find inspiring and then you fixed it. You have to put the machinery together to give people a different experience.
Can I go back to the grievance side of it? One of the things that struck us in the evidence that we've had is a culture that if you make a complaint, and we've heard particularly shocking examples of clear misogyny and racism, and yet if you put your head above the parapet to complain about that, there then is a sort of a conspiracy of management and others, including union officials, covering up, that sort of weigh in, and basically you can wave goodbye to your career, and that's been said in actual terms to some of the victims that we've seen. So how have you changed, or in the process of changing, those grievance procedures in West Sussex so that some of the people we have heard evidence from could feel safer in coming forward with genuine grievances without it being the end of their careers effectively? Because there does seem to be this sort of network, and we're trying to get to the bottom of who is responsible for this network of senior managers, people in positions of responsibility who are still in positions of responsibility that sort of cover it all up, and then when the inspector appears, they put on a good show and the inspector goes away, ticked all the boxes, and nothing's done about it.
It's a really good question, and it's absolutely something that I've recognised. I've spoken very openly about my own experiences and how difficult that I found it as a firefighter and coming up through the ranks to challenge some of the experiences that I was having. And it wasn't necessarily because I didn't think anything would be done about it, quite the opposite. I was concerned about how I would be perceived by people around me. So I think there is absolutely something about recognising that it's not just the processes that impact on this. This is about the culture. One of our priorities within our service, which is aimed at tackling precisely this, is to create a sense of psychological safety. It's something that we take so seriously that it's one of our key priorities in our community risk management plan, which is our overarching strategy for the service. And to create a sense of psychological safety, you will create an environment where people can speak up and challenge. And often, when I talk about psychological safety, people mistake it for coming to work and feeling happy. And it would be a lovely byproduct if that was the case. But when you have real psychological safety, people are prepared to come into work and have a difficult conversation, knowing that they're not going to be derided for it, knowing that they're not going to be humiliated for it. And as a consequence, they also feel more able to talk about mistakes and failures. And when you're talking about those openly, then you're more able to challenge them and do something about it. So if I can share with you a very specific piece of work that we have going on at the moment that's aimed at helping with psychological safety to help precisely this piece. We have 82 teams around West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, which means you potentially have 82 different subcultures. When we talk about the culture of the organisation, you may have an overarching culture. You may have a set of beliefs and expectations for the way that you can behave. But actually, when you go into work and you're working with a smaller team of people, you might have a different culture. You might have a different subculture, a different level of acceptability of what you can say or how you can behave within that group of people. So for us, it's not good enough just to say, well, we're going to set our standard. We've got a clear behavioural framework. We'll be clear about what bullying is and what it isn't. We can do all of those bits and pieces, but if we're not serious about having those conversations at that subculture level, then it won't matter.
And how do you know that's working?
So we're doing some work on that at the moment. We've brought in some external people to do the work because we recognise that we don't have the skill sets within our service to be able to do that. And the key is not just to identify what the culture is, but to mediate between those people, to challenge the culture and to change the culture. So that's still ongoing at the moment, but the early indications have been incredibly positive. It's not enough just to go in and do it once. It's based on team coaching and leadership coaching as well throughout the service. But the idea is for them to go in and have those conversations about what the expectation is within that group of people and what behaviour looks like. And then to mediate between people to repair relationships, identify relationships or expectations that might be out of kilter with our values as a service, and then return to those teams to do further coaching work. On top of that, we're doing the work with our own staff so that our own managers will have the skill sets to go in and do that. And in terms of how we know it's working, there are a couple of ways that's important for us to monitor. We have a people and culture dashboard that we use, which is now best practice. It's on the NFCC Positive Practice portal. A number of other fire and rescue services use it as well. And this people and culture dashboard breaks down all of our data sets by protected characteristic as well, so that we can identify whether there is any evidence that a particular group within the service is being disproportionately impacted or affected by anything that we're doing. That's one aspect of that. But on top of that, it's really important not just to look at data, because you might miss stuff. If you're not looking at the right data, then there's things that you might not capture. So we also run a series of focus groups, which we now repeat every other year, so that we can make sure that we are listening to the service, that if there are things that are happening that we're not aware of, we're getting that feedback through. But again, I go back to the machinery piece. This is done in a really systematic way that we can then feed back into the service. On top of that, if I might, we also have what we call a shadow board. This is a group of staff, many of whom have lived experience of being underrepresented within the service in some way. And they have all of our decision-making papers before we do as an executive board. And they meet, they review them, they comment on them. And the way that I describe it, it's like when we're making a decision, we're throwing a pebble into a pond, and we're so focused on where the pebble lands that we might miss the ripple effects. By having this team of people that review those and then come into our meeting and feed back to us, they're telling us where all the ripples are that we might otherwise be blind to. So we've got lots of measures to indicate whether or not it's working. And I wouldn't be so virtuous as to sit in front of you and tell you that it's fixed and that this will solve everything, because culture change is ongoing. We have to be constantly looking at this, constantly being alive to what the experiences of our people are and constantly responding to that. And we might do things that don't work, and that's okay, because we can recognise that and go back and do something differently.
Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Chair. How successful do you think that you are in doing this?
So, in terms of how successful we are, I think that it has had a significant impact. In the last focus group that we ran, 89% of staff fed back that they felt like the culture in their teams and departments had improved. So we do have some positive signs of success. When we first started the culture work, and I must stress we've been doing this since 2019, so it's certainly not just been a recent event. When we first started doing this work, we noticed an initial spike in the grievances that we were having, because we changed the process and we were talking about what we could accept and what we couldn't accept in work. And that was a sign to us that people had more faith in the system and they were more likely to use the system. In addition to that, we also run a restorative approach. So it's not just about the formal sanctions that we can give. We're looking at people's emotional well-being as a result of going through the process. We're looking at ways in which we can change our own policies and procedures if they've impacted as well. And we're looking at ways in which we can make sure that morally those wrongs have been righted. And so in terms of how we know these things are working, we're constantly checking the data. We constantly have those focus groups that are ongoing. We have a connectivity plan within the service. That means people have an opportunity to feed into and connect with each other within the service that we're constantly taking feedback from. So it's a constant temperature check. There are really positive indications from things where people are now proud of the service today, where they absolutely weren't 4 or 5 years ago. And so for me, these are all indications that things are working. But as I said, there isn't a silver bullet. We have to keep focusing on this. And to do this, I have to say, takes resources. Leadership is really important. I'm accountable, but all of us are responsible for the culture. Everybody has a role to play with the interactions that they have with each other. But to do the kind of really intensive cultural work that I'm describing to you takes resource. I'm fortunate being a fire and rescue service embedded within a county council. I've been able to lean into the council and to get resources to do the work that I've been describing to you. Not all fire and rescue services have been so successful in that.
I would like to talk about other fire services. Mm-hmm. So we've had a lot of evidence from individuals who would not recognise what you've just described. And we're not just talking about people who have minor grievances. We've heard from people who've experienced racism, misogyny, bullying, and worse for me, sexual assault. And we've heard from people who talk about they wanted to drive into a wall, they wanted to take their own life because the stuff that they were reporting was being ignored. Mm-hmm. That they were the subject of gossip amongst very many officers in the fire service, that their complaints were ignored, that no action was taken. And that for me, there is no bigger problem when people are afraid to speak out publicly. If they have to come to us and ask us for anonymity, that says to me there's a huge problem here, because not only are they fearful that the complaints they've already put in will be problematic, but they're afraid to be seen to be making further complaints. So how do you see that you're going to be able to rectify, especially historic things? You can't go back and undo a sexual assault. That person's life is completely destroyed because of what happened under the watch of the fire service, and yet that was not just ignored, but it was brushed over, and somebody made the decision that the person responsible for that sexual assault should face no punishment whatsoever except being allowed to retire quietly and go off into the wilderness. That can't be right. That can't be allowed to continue. So how do you remedy that? How do you stop that continuing?
I absolutely agree with you. It's completely unacceptable. One thing that fire and rescue services have now, on top of the whistleblowing policies and the opportunities to whistleblow, is an independent reporting line. With whistleblowing, there are some quite tight parameters over what constitutes whistleblowing. It has to be in the public interest, it's protected by law, but crucially, the complaint goes into the same service. Most fire and rescue services, mine included, now have an independent reporting line. Ours goes to an external organisation, so that if somebody wants to make a complaint, something that they don't feel comfortable enough to raise within the service, they have that guarantee of anonymity, and that's important. In terms of the experiences that people have, I should say first and foremost, I am personally so sorry that people have had those experiences. They're experiences that I recognise as well, so I absolutely understand the gravity of them and how much it impacts on your everyday life, not just when you go into work, but your entire lens that you see the world through. And we need to do better as a sector. Those experiences that people have had, and we've done some work in our service with historical experiences, even if those people have left, and even if they think it's historical, actually there is something about it, you carry that with you, and it's important to acknowledge that and give someone the closure that they need to be able to move on.
So what I would say to you is the people that we've heard evidence from who will not publicly give this evidence, they would not recognise what you were saying, because their experience, contemporary experience, what's happening now, is nothing like what you were explaining, and they are still afraid to come forward. So it's not that successful. It's not working right across the country, obviously.
I can't talk to other fire and rescue services and the success that they've had with these, but I can talk to the experience that we've had in our service and the impact that I believe that that's having. One thing I would say is that as an NFCC, we're better now at sharing best practice. So the description of the interventions that I'm talking about here have been shared with the NFCC through the Positive Practice portal, and a number of them have now been adopted by other fire and rescue services as well. I gave the example of the People and Culture dashboard. So I would hope that it begins to improve.
Well, I think they would disagree with you. One last question. You talked about in the public interest. What's the threshold that's in the public interest? Because I would argue that any workplace which is not offering support and protection for their staff, if they choose to whistleblow, that's in the public interest. So what's the threshold?
It's something that is set out within law. In terms of each one that would come in, it would go into our legal department, and they would be assessing the threshold for those things. But what I would say is I think it's really important that we're not just relying on whistleblowing, which is why it's important to make the distinction between the whistleblowing and the independent reporting line, where people can report anything that they feel uncomfortable with.
Thank you, Chair.
Kim Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, Dr. Cohen-Hatton. I just want to start by saying that we recognise that the vast majority of fire fighters and fire workers do an exemplary job. You know, they put their lives on the line every single day. But we're looking at, you know, a toxic culture that exists at the moment. But you mentioned about the dashboard that's in place at the moment. So I was just curious in terms of how that works, how that's monitored, and who's responsible for overseeing that?
We have a people and organisational development team within our service, and they essentially own the dashboard. The dashboard breaks down a range of indicators by protected characteristic, and we're adding to it all the time as well. So we'll monitor sickness, for example, by protected characteristic. We'll monitor recruitment by protected characteristic, and a range of other indicators, promotions, etc., etc. And those are really important factors so that we can make sure that we're constantly checking. We're constantly looking.
And can I ask though, does that provide data in terms of the attrition levels of, you know, black officers who are leaving, women officers who are leaving, and looking at the reasons for those leaving the service?
The dashboard does break down the data. In terms of the reasons for leaving the service, we always conduct exit interviews, so we collect that data as well.
You mentioned earlier, or the Chair mentioned earlier, about the WhatsApp groups and, you know, the horrendous messages that were placed by senior officers. I'd like to know what safeguarding the services has put in place to support those women that those messages were aimed at. And I know that's not your service, but what would generally happen in terms of safeguarding people, and particularly women, under those circumstances?
Well, while I can't speak to that service specifically, can I give you an example of what we would do in our service, if that would be helpful to the committee? In our service, if something like that happened, we would always allocate a welfare officer, and we always take a person-centred approach to this, because you can't just have a policy that says this is all you'll have if something like that happens, because it depends completely on the individual, their experiences, and the circumstances which they find themselves in as well. So having welfare officers is absolutely crucial within that. We would be running a risk assessment around suspension as well to ascertain whether or not suspension would be appropriate within those circumstances. We have a range of wellbeing interventions within our service as well, not just through the employee support, occupational health services as well. but a range of other interventions. But the most important thing within this is that the individual that's experiencing it feels safe and secure in the workplace. So it would be a conversation with them at the absolute centre of this.
Thanks, Dr. Cohen. But I would suggest that those women in Shropshire probably don't feel safe. You know, and as a former trade union official, I would say, you know, that those people responsible, that should have been suspended immediately pending an inquiry to make sure those people were safe. But I'll leave that one there. My next question is about how confident you are in terms of His Majesty's Inspectorate, in terms of the job that they do, because we've heard examples of services getting an outraged, outstanding and good, and then literally weeks later, you know, we hear about the toxic culture of racism and bullying and sexual assault. Does the service need to be reviewed and looked at and changed?
The Inspectorate gives us a report that reflects back the service at a moment in time, and they also measure a range of things, not just people. So it's quite a broad review that they do when they come into the services. In my experience, I have found the inspection regime to be helpful. It's provided levers for me as a Chief Fire Officer for improvement that perhaps weren't there previously. Certainly, following our inspection report back in 2018, we were able to access funding for improvement, which was absolutely instrumental in terms of our improvement journey and the cultural work that we've been able to do. So whilst I'd say that there's always room for improvement in anything that you do, I think that in the grand scheme of things, the move to an inspectorate for fire and rescue has been a helpful one.
Final question. We have heard harrowing evidence from serving firefighters in terms of racism, misogyny and bullying. But what I find very concerning is that it's a spread across the country. So it says an awful lot about a toxic culture that has been allowed to develop in services. And I'd like to know, you talked about, you know, policies and procedures, but, you know, it's great to have policies and procedures, but it's another thing implementing and taking decisive action. Are you seeing that happening at the moment?
We certainly are in our service. Since 2018, we have had 40 grievances, 60% of which have resulted in formal sanctions, including dismissals. So I'm absolutely seeing that activity taking place. I think doing that hand in hand with restorative practice is really important, though, because it's not just about the retribution or the justice for whatever's just happened, but it's about how we have a workplace that's effective with psychological safety moving forwards, and how we make sure that people thrive after those experiences. People shouldn't be having those experiences. That much is clear. But actually, this is about what we can do to change that and what we do to make sure they have a different experience afterwards as well. Thank you.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Cohen-Hatton, for joining us. Some of the evidence we've heard is around the importance of whistleblowing and people being able to tell their stories. But we've also heard the challenges there, where, you know, people who do come forward are accused of being a grass, and, you know, it's not a culture that encourages that. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've done in your service to make that a more acceptable approach and make sure that people's voices are valued and heard.
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier on, our focus has been on building psychological safety, and that's been a theme throughout everything that we've been doing in the service. I now have a completely new leadership team to the one that I started with within the service. And I think one of the things that we've all been focused on as people have come into those positions is what we can do differently that considers the impact on people. People are our biggest resource within the service. They make the service they make the service what it is. So making sure that they're taken care of as part and parcel of what we're doing has been at the forefront of everything. So there's been that aspect. In terms of how people feel and their confidence to use those processes, we had experiences where people were being bullied previously. One of the first things that we did was set out some really clear criteria for what bullying looked like, because there were people that were being bullied that didn't even realise they were being bullied, so entrenched was the practice, and that absolutely had to change. So a really clear approach to what that looked like, a very clear behavioural framework that people could relate to, so that they knew what an acceptable behaviour looked like practically, not just words on a page, but what it actually looked like was really important. But look, people have to have different experiences. One of the things that I've realised as I've been doing this work is the power of the stories that happen. People will talk with great confidence about something that happened that, when we've looked into it, actually predated even their own employment. But such is the impact of the legacy of those examples. So it's not enough just to fix them, it's just to fix the things. We have to fix the perceptions as well. And that means giving people a different experience. And that will take time as well, because it's based on people's belief systems. And we have to give them a reason to believe something differently. And one thing that I think is also worth stressing within this, because I think we've spoken really powerfully about the impact on people's mental health. I saw some really alarming statistics that showed that between 2007 and 2018, there were 13 firefighters in the UK that took their own lives. The impact of the workplace that we have on individuals' mental health is something that's really important to us. And it's not just about the cultural experience that people have. Firefighters are disproportionately exposed to traumatic offence, and research that's been done has also shown that we're less likely to ask for support than the general population when it does happen. And I am really alive to the fact that suicide has been the biggest killer of men under 45 as well. When we're talking about the culture of the fire service, we've been talking really powerfully about the impact of those underrepresented within that, and that is so important. But it's also important to represent to acknowledge the culture of the men within the service as well, and the impact of not being able to speak out or to express emotions or to be able to ask for help because of the impact of that, the toxicity of that culture, and the need to be strong and the need to be masculine. So there's absolutely something that I think that's important about how we take care of everybody's well-being in the service, and we've had a lot of work that we've done around mental health for everybody within the service as well. It might look different for different people, and those nuances are critical if this is going to be a service that people can access and use. But I do think it's important to recognise those impacts on everybody too.
Thank you. And can I just ask one about, so Chair brought this up at the beginning around the toxicity of some of these WhatsApp groups that we know exist, and I know we're looking at the fire and rescue service at the moment, but we've looked at culture in policing as well, and there's similarities there around, you know, the supposed safe spaces of these private groups, or what's discussed in the back of the van, or, you know, when you get back to base. And there's one set of changes which are the very visible ones that might get inspected and seen to be in place, but there's that sort of deep-seated cultural aspect where it's harder to scratch below the surface and see what's really going on there and make those changes. I just wonder if you could give your reflections on what drives effective change there, and starts to, you know, when people are in the privacy of those conversations, change behaviours in that space.
Yeah, and that precisely is the premise of the really targeted work that we've done around leadership and team coaching, at targeting those subcultures at that team level. We can do loads of focus groups, we can do loads of work organisationally, we can say things are going to be different, but until you have those very specific coaching sessions, that mediation between individuals, you need to give people the skills to be able to have that psychological safety within that environment and to challenge the environment that they're in. Look, firefighters' greatest strength is the teamwork. We send firefighters into situations that are life-determining, and it's really difficult. So you will be relying on those other people around you, potentially for life-determining circumstances. That strength in that teamwork can also be our biggest downfall sometimes, because to have that strength in the team, you need the cohesiveness of a team. And when you're working together in a small group of people, sometimes the cohesiveness of the team becomes more important than stepping up and challenging, putting your head above the parapet and saying something that might not be received well by the rest of the team. Even if you think it might not be received well, that's as powerful as whether or not it is actually received well. So going in and targeting the interventions at that team level is really important. I want to have strong teams in the service, but I want to have strong teams that are inclusive for everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Dr. Cohen-Hatton. You said you've been in the force, I think, was it 23 years?
Yes.
23 years. So obviously you've seen some changes over that time, hopefully for the better. Misogynism, racism, sexism and bullying. Have you seen cases of this while serving in the fire service?
Yes.
And what did you do about it?
I've seen a number where I've been the presiding officer, for example, in disciplinary cases. I've had a range of experiences myself, which I've been very open about, and I've talked about publicly, which have been incredibly difficult. But I have seen those cases, yes.
Excellent. One question about inspectors. Now, I've worked in industry before where we was given fair warning an inspector was coming. So we'd tidy up our workplace and make sure that everything was in order. And it's one thing an inspector coming to inspect the operational side of things, i.e. how do you put fires out, how do you rescue cats from trees and stuff like that. But the cultural bit that I think Simon touched on earlier is how does the inspector get into people's heads that the workforce, do they actually speak to the workforce when they're on site anonymously?
They do. They have an anonymous survey that they run prior to the inspection, and then they do something called reality testing, where they'll go into a service and they'll assess what they've seen or what they've seen through the documentation that's been provided with people's experiences within the workplace as well.
And as a senior boss of the fire service in your area, do you do these surveys, these anonymous surveys for staff?
We have the anonymous reporting line, yes, and
Yeah.
we run the focus groups regularly as well. I mentioned every other year, so that we can have those discussions to take a temperature check of the workplace too.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm so sorry, could I just go back to the first point that
Yes,
you
of
made
course.
as well, if that's okay, because I think it's a really important one. We talked about those cases of sexism and misogyny and racism within the service, but I think I'd also like to flag to the committee, if I can, some of the experiences that we've had from outside of the service as well. One of the things that has really struck me, particularly since taking a senior leadership position within the service, is some of the abuse and harassment that we've had, not from within the service, but externally to the service. I myself have had to have police intervention twice, one of which was recorded as a hate crime, and the abuse and the harassment has extended to my family as well. It's not acceptable. Public service should not be synonymous with public abuse, and it has to stop. When you are underrepresented in some way, when you look different, I understand that you will challenge people's expectations. We all have our own biases and stereotypes that we hold. It is a result of the experiences that we have and the way that our brains categorise that information. So it's completely understandable that someone might have a bias, but when you don't recognise it and you act in a way that is going to harm somebody, that for me is when it starts to become a problem. And too many fire chiefs who have protected characteristics are also subject to the harassment and the abuse that I've described. My home address is marked with the police, and I am not the only principal officer who has a protected characteristic that is in that same position. And especially when you're trying to do something differently and challenge a very long-standing status quo, you can be subject to more. If we're serious about cultural change within the fire and rescue service, which I'm convinced that we are, we need to also take account of the wider society that we're operating in and some of the harms that come with that as well. We have to be better. It's not an excuse. We absolutely have to be better. But if we're going to be successful within our workplaces, we have to take account of the environment that our staff are in 24 hours a day, not just the hours that we have them with us.
Yeah, I think you make that point very well. I'm just going to take one final question from Tim Lawton.
Just very quickly about recruitment of women, and obviously one of the cultural problems is what do you want to call it, a sort of laddism culture, which can be very, very toxic. So nationally, the figure is 8%, I think, of women, which is double what it was 10 years ago, but still tiny compared to, say, 37% in the police. In Sussex, West Sussex, we're recruiting 20% women, but because the turnover in the fire service is relatively small, certainly compared with the police, it's going to take some time to get that 8% up to an appreciable level. What can we do about that? How can we make that faster? Do we need to be turning over more people in the fire service who really shouldn't be there and replacing them with women who might help change that culture? Are we not appealing to women? Not enough women candidates coming forward? How do we get more women in the service generally?
I mean, I'm really pleased that you asked that question, because I think for me, one of the things that's important to stress is we absolutely, and selfishly as a fire chief, I want the best of the best to be firefighters. I'm not a fan of quotas. I don't think a sign of success is a number of people. I think the sign of success is the best people. The problem that I have is that the stereotype of a firefighter, people's image of a firefighter, is so narrow. In truth, I'm only getting the best of a very narrow demographic of people to whom that stereotype appeals. My measure of success will be to appeal to a much broader range of people, so I genuinely do get the best of the best. That stereotype is incredibly deeply ingrained, and it's also incredibly pernicious. Some of the best successes that we've had have been through challenging what people's idea of a firefighter is. So, for example, some youth engagement schemes in a previous service I was involved in, at one point 27% of our female firefighters, almost a third, had progressed through a youth engagement scheme because they've experienced what they can contribute to the service, and they have a better understanding of the breadth of roles available to them. And there are some asks that I would have of the committee to consider which might help fire and rescue services, both in terms of cultural change and recruitment, actually. And there are three. The first one is around support in helping us to change the image of a firefighter. The turnover aspect I'm less concerned with, because I think one of the benefits that we have with firefighters with a great deal of experience is precisely that experience and the benefit that that gives us on the fire ground. So I'm comfortable with that aspect. What I would love is a different stereotype. But to really challenge that isn't something that an individual fire service will have great success with on their own. It would need a really joined up approach nationally, and that would take the kind of resourcing that isn't available to fire and rescue services at present. So a national campaign that gives a more accurate representation of what being a firefighter is today would be really helpful. The second ask that I would have for you to consider is strengthening harassment laws for those of us in public service. At the moment, the threshold is incredibly high, and whilst the police have been incredibly helpful when we've approached them, the threshold probably doesn't match the harassment that senior leaders, particularly those of us who are different in some way, are experiencing. That would be the second ask. And that's not just for senior leaders, actually. That's for people throughout the services as well. None of us should have to experience that kind of harassment because of the work that we choose to do to help people. And then the third one is around resourcing. As I said, I've been incredibly fortunate in West Sussex with the support that I've received from the council and the additional funding that we've had. Not all fire and rescue services are that fortunate, particularly in standalone fire and rescue services, where to resource this kind of activity, you need to make a cut. Unfortunately, we've had 5 years of single-year financial settlements, which make long-term planning incredibly difficult. And I think at the last count, it was something like 83% of our funding from central government had been reduced, and for 8 years, we've had no capital funding from central government as well. So to do this, we need to put resource into that, and that's resource that at the moment we don't have because we're so focused on trying to keep the fire engines on the run and available for the public that finding extra is really difficult.
Thank you for that. Now, Simon Fell, you had a very quick question.
And I will be brief. Thank you, Dr. Cohen-Hatton. And I just want to go back to your previous response around some of the harassment and experiences you've had from wider society. You've spoken very eloquently about that, and I'm sorry to hear about those experiences. You've partly answered this in response to Ms. Lawton's question around the support you've had from the police, but some of this has got to be about visibility for your officers and your staff, seeing that when a complaint is made, the police and other public services take that seriously and respond to it. Have you felt that they've looked at your concerns seriously and you've had a decent response from them?
Police, absolutely. And it is something that we've shared with staff, and I speak very openly about those experiences as well, because I think it's important to talk about the things that you find difficult and that make you feel vulnerable as much as you would talk about your successes, because then other people can share the things that worry them as well. What I would say is it is having a significant impact on recruitment within fire and rescue services, particularly in senior roles. Speaking to staff that are on programs that are designed to prepare people for those senior roles, the feedback that we're having from people is that they're not sure that they want to take senior officer positions anymore. And sadly, that's something that we're finding filtering through into the recruitment processes at present as well.
Okay, my final question is, would you say that the Fire and Rescue Service is institutionally racist, misogynistic, homophobic?
think the point that I would make is we operate against a backdrop of society that has systemic inequalities within it as well. We're still reporting on a gender pay gap. We still have huge health inequalities within our country, and socioeconomic status is something that has some incredible impacts on people.
You've pointed to that several times about society, but I'm interested in the fire and rescue service. Do you think it's institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic?
To be able to say that, I have to have the data in front of me that would demonstrate it. When I first landed in West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, there were aspects that systemically affected different groups of people. For example, some of our fire stations only had male facilities. It's not just about rectifying those aspects, which we have absolutely done. It's about being proactive to make sure that they're not anymore.
Okay.
So I would not say that we are institutionally misogynistic.
Would you say systemically then? Because that's what the Metropolitan Police Commissioner talks about, doesn't he? He doesn't talk about institutional, he talks about systemic.
I think that we are so proactive in our data, in monitoring our data and listening to our workforce, that I'm really confident that we've done those aspects within our service. Yes.
But generally,
it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on other fire and rescue services, but I would absolutely
you're the
acknowledge
National
that we
Lead for
have more to do.
Improvement.
I'm the National Lead for Improvement, but I don't have the data in front of me that would enable me to be able to say another fire and rescue service is institutionally sexist or racist or misogynistic. That would have to be something that you would have to ask each individual chief.
Okay, well that's a very interesting point to end on. Can I thank you very much for coming before us today? I think it's been a very interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Good morning, and sorry to keep you waiting, but we had a very interesting first panel. We're very pleased to see you before us today. This is the opportunity for the Home Affairs Select Committee to look into the Brook House Inquiry report and to look at progress. Just before we do that, I'm just going to ask if any members of the committee have any declarations they wish to make.
Chair, I should declare that a member of my family works at Brook House.
Thank you, Mr. Lawton. And the aims for this session are to hear from Kate Eaves, former chair of the Brook House Inquiry, about her assessment of the inquiry's key findings and recommendations, to examine the Brook House Inquiry report's key findings and recommendations and look at progress that's been made since publication, to consider key concerns arising from the committee's recent visit to Brook House, and to understand how progress of the inquiry's recommendations will be monitored moving forward. So I wondered, first of all, Kate, would you just like to introduce yourself to the committee?
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kate Eaves. I was formerly the chair of the Brook House Inquiry.
Thank you. And Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Chair. My name's Anna Pincus. I'm director of Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. It's a charity based in Crawley that supports people during and after immigration detention, and we were core participants in the public inquiry into abuse at Brook House.
Thank you. Kate, I wondered if you could set out for the committee what you think the key recommendations from your report were, and perhaps talk a little bit about what's happened since the publication of your report.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the committee this morning. So the Brook House Inquiry lasted for just to give a little bit of context, just under 4 years. We heard from 101 witnesses, reviewed both undercover and body-worn camera footage, all of which is still available on our website if any committee members would like to familiarise themselves with that. Took reports from 3 expert witnesses and produced an over 700-page report. The headline, I suppose, that the committee will want to be aware of is that looking at the 5-month period of what was happening at Brook House, and this was the period from April to August 2017, I found 19 incidents where there was credible evidence of mistreatment, which I found to be capable of amounting to mistreatment which is contrary to Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The reason that the wording is the way that it is because you will no doubt be aware that Section 2 of the Inquiries Act means that it is not the responsibility of a statutory inquiry to find either civil or criminal liability. So that wording is very deliberately crafted to reflect that. But nonetheless, 19 serious incidents of mistreatment. Just to give you a flavour of what that included, there were 10 instances of inappropriate use of force on detainees. Force was used on naked or near-naked detainees, which I found to be humiliating. Unnecessary pain was used in a number of instances during use of force incidents. Dangerous restraint technique was used several times. This is a restraint technique which had been previously associated with the death by asphyxiation of Jimmy Mabenga, who was also in immigration detention. I also found use of inappropriate and humiliating comments against detainees during active suicide attempts. Homophobic comments being used towards detainees, and initially failing to help a detainee following a suicide attempt when he was lying on the floor with a ligature around his neck. So aside from the 19 incidents, I found that there were a combination of issues which, when woven together, constituted a toxic culture which meant that mistreatment was more likely to happen. I made 33 recommendations, 31 of those for government. And those recommendations covered a variety of different issues. So I'll whiz through them very quickly, if that's helpful. I found the physical environment to be entirely unsuitable for detaining people for anything other than a short period of time. Brook House is, as you will know from having visited, is a building that's designed to the specification of a Category B prison. Coupled with that harsh physical environment and the indefinite nature of detention, which caused, I found, anxiety and uncertainty and distress for detained people, I made a recommendation that there should be a 28-day time limit on detention in such environments. I found that far too often there was a failure to follow the government's own rules around safeguarding and protecting particularly the most vulnerable people in detention, and I'm very happy to talk in more detail later on about those specific rules, but they relate to people who are particularly vulnerable in terms of their mental or physical health, and also the rules around the extra powers that can be used against people once they're in detention, so such as using force against them or segregating them from the rest of the population. So I found that the overwhelming misunderstanding and disregard for those rules left already vulnerable people at an enhanced risk of harm. The committee will probably also be aware that there are high levels of mental illness in the detained population, and a significant proportion are likely to be vulnerable, acutely vulnerable, many having been victims of torture or exposed to trauma. I found that medical staff did not sufficiently understand their safeguarding duties in relation to detained people, particularly around the issue of use of force. They didn't understand their responsibilities. Use of force itself is deliberately governed by very strict rules. It should only be used as a last resort. It should never be unnecessary, inappropriate or excessive. And too often I found that it was the case that at Brook House those things were not being followed. The most serious incident involving use of force, which some of the committee may well be aware of, was an incident which involved applying pressure to the neck of a man who was highly distressed, and the footage of that incident is available on the inquiry's website. There was significant understaffing. I found that the G4S, who at the time were the contractors running Brook House, were dysfunctional as a senior management team, and too often junior staff were left to manage extremely complex and difficult situations on their own. Staff were essentially insufficiently trained, and there were too few numbers of them to deal with the very complex nature of their job. I also found that there were issues with not having developed a healthy staff culture, and actually staff were alarmingly desensitised to the distress that they were seeing around them of the detained population, and actually the lack of supervision and leadership by the senior management team left staff to develop their own inappropriate coping mechanisms and ultimately led to that malignant staff culture.
Gosh, that's quite a catalogue. And I'm sure we will want to ask you specific questions. I just want to ask you to start us off around one of your recommendations, which was about the safeguarding of vulnerable detainees. And what we knew from the government was they were carrying out a review of that. We also understand in the last day or so, the government have now issued new regulations around that, new policy. I wondered, are you able to comment on that and what you think of what the approach the government are taking?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, as you say, obviously that guidance only came out, and I understand it's draft guidance at the moment, only came out yesterday. So I have been furiously trying to get my head around it, understand what the implications may be. I think, in summary, the guidance which is around the adults at risk process, it appears essentially to be moving towards weakening the protections for vulnerable detainee populations. So specifically, I talk in the report about rules 34 and 35 of the detention centre rules, and those are the rules which essentially are the pathway through which specifically vulnerable detainees are identified to government to have a review of whether their detention should be continued, whether it's appropriate for that to happen.
Give an example, just so we understand what kind of factors would be taken
Absolutely.
into account.
So there are essentially three strands to Rule 35. So the first of those is if somebody's health, whether that's physical or mental health, is going to be injuriously affected by being detained, then that should prompt a review to take place over whether that detention continues to be appropriate for that individual. The second prong is if there is evidence of suicidal intention. So if somebody has been identified as being at risk of serious self-harm or suicide, then that in itself should prompt a review of that person's detention. And the third factor is if there is evidence of somebody having been a victim of torture previously. So those three prongs should prompt a review, which then goes back to the Home Office to actually do an assessment of whether they still believe that detention is appropriate, having weighed all of the factors that they need to weigh. So the rule intersects very closely with the adults at risk policy. And what my findings in the inquiry have shown is that there needs to be a strengthening of the provisions and the way that they are actually implemented. I should add that I don't necessarily think there's any problem with the ways that Rule 34 and Rule 35 are drafted. The problem is that they're not used in the way that they were intended. And as I read it, the adults at risk policy effectively constitutes somewhat of a departure from what the original intention was of the adults at risk, which is essentially about minimising the use of detention for people who are specifically considered to be vulnerable. And so actually it's a move in the opposite direction from what I have suggested is needed, which is a doubling down to make sure that the safeguards that are in place are actually being implemented in the way that the rules intended for them to be.
And also, just briefly, if you could just comment on the issue of the second opinion.
Yes.
Could you just say a little bit about that and what your view about that is?
Sure. So the second opinion, to kind of put it in lay terms, I guess, is around the ability to have a second specialist medical opinion. So if an external medico-legal report has been completed for an individual and that report has said, yes, this person appears to have been a victim of torture, then that, under the old guidelines, would have meant that that person automatically becomes what's known as a level 3 adult at risk, which affords a certain consideration of whether their detention is appropriate. under the revised guidance, at my understanding at the moment, it looks like what will happen is that there can be a second medical opinion which would be given by a Home Office contracted clinician, and then the Home Office needs to consider those two opinions in conjunction. My concern, I guess, would be that how is a non-medically trained Home Office caseworker going to decide between two complex medical opinions, and is there essentially building in, firstly, a delay in assessing whether this person really is safe to be detained. Secondly, a potential re-traumatising of that individual in going through the process a second time. And thirdly, I'm not entirely clear on why that is needed, what the evidence is to show that that second opinion is needed. So I think those are things that, looking at it from my perspective, I would certainly want to understand more when thinking about the potential impact that that has. And I think what I probably would want to add is that all of these potential changes are happening when we currently have no independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration. And I know that part of the former Chief Inspector's programme of work had been to look at adults at risk. And so it's really concerning to me that what appears to be guidance moving in the opposite direction to what I have recommended based on all of this evidence is going to be happening at a time that it doesn't have sufficient scrutiny from an independent perspective.
Did the Home Office speak to you about their plans for this draft guidance?
No, the first I was aware of it was when a kind colleague, former colleague, told me yesterday that it had been published. So no, I had no idea it was coming. What I would say is that in the government response to my recommendations, they note that they were undertaking a review of adults at risk and the Rule 35 process. What I'm not clear on is whether the publication of this draft guidance means that that review has therefore concluded, which if it has, I would dearly love to see what the results of that were. So I just don't know what the sequence of events is, but I was not unaware. I was not aware at all that it was being published.
Thank you. Tim Lawson.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Pincus, can I ask you about the evidence you gave to the committee? In your conclusions, you said that you continued to observe and have reported a range of extremely concerning working practices and staff behaviours at Brook House and Tinsley House. And then your final conclusion is 6 months on from the Brook House Inquiry report, there has been no meaningful change nor any sign that the government is taking the inquiry findings seriously, which is quite a damning statement. Why do you think that it's as bad as it ever was?
We're meeting people on a daily basis in the centre, so this is my response based upon their testimony of their experience at Brook House. So there may be reviews, there may be considerations going on. I'm not speaking to those. I'm just saying that for people on the ground, there's no discernible change. In fact, there are elements that have actually worsened in the way people are experiencing detention at present.
How are you getting comparisons? Because obviously there's some people who have been there for longer, but then there'll be an awful lot of people who didn't know the previous regime. So how could they make a comparison whether it's worse or not?
They're not making a comparison. They're telling me how they experience it. And I'm saying that the same themes are repeating and repeating and repeating. Nothing is improving. Some things are becoming worse, in fact. For example, the report asked for a consideration of the lock-in regime, and that's recently been extended to the time that people are locked up for roll call at lunchtime in the evening has extended, and people feel that kind of intrusion on their time, on being locked back down in the room, as something very difficult to endure.
Do you speak just to the detainees? Do you speak to staff as well? Or does staff come and speak to you unofficially or to complain about things, or how does it work?
We go into the centres to support people in detention, but in the process of that, of course, we have exchanges with staff and we get to know them very well over years. Of course, people in detention leave sometimes frequently, but staff are there for decades. So relationships build up, and of course they're very open with us. It's a difficult place to work. You're dealing with high levels of people who are trauma survivors, who have complex mental health needs, who present in ways that are very challenging for staff. And staffing levels are still an issue at Brook House, and this has an impact on the way that staff relate to people in detention. They'll have less patience just to understand the conversations that are being brought to them by people who don't have English as a first language. They'll have less time to be able to speak to people using interpreter services. And we see, petty frustrations in the way that staff deal with detained people on a regular basis.
So what is your worst fear? What do you lose sleep over in terms of things that could go seriously wrong at Brook House? Obviously, the inquiry threw up most of all behavioural attitudes between the staff towards the detainees there. Now, the management firm has changed. Various people have been moved on or have moved on, and obviously there must be a consciousness of the shortcomings, to put it mildly, that were revealed in Katie's report. But you're sort of suggesting that the attitudes between staff and the detainees has not really improved to any appreciable degree, despite everything that's come out?
We certainly hear that the experience of detained people is that staff are impatient, will raise their voice, will use inappropriate language, will be dismissive. In terms of the centre staff, they are much more open with us as a charity now than they were when it was G4S in post. We now have our drop-in sessions, which were mentioned in the inquiry, in the main body of the centre as well as on the visits corridor, which enables us to reach a greater range of people. But there are still limits on how far we can go. So you asked me what keeps me awake at night. What keeps me awake at night is that I know there are people in detention who lack the capacity to reach out to us, who may be held in isolation because their behaviours are challenging and that's the only place that the staff can manage them, who have severe mental health conditions, who we don't know about, who we can't reach. And therefore, it's deeply regrettable that the Home Office took the decision that our charity could not be part of Safer Community meetings, which is a forum when different agencies in the centre come together to consider people who are at particular risk. We attended these meetings. Serco welcomed our attendance. They said that we added value. We were able to add a lot of granular detail to the discussions that were going on because obviously detained people trust us very much and are very open with us. But when we came to negotiate our MOU with Serco to enable our drop-in sessions to take place, the Home Office said that the condition in the MOU that said we were allowed to attend Safer Community meetings had to be redacted.
What reason was given?
Confidentiality was given as the reason, and Serco replied to the Home Office and said that they were willing to run the meetings in such a way that there would be no breach of confidentiality, and we still weren't permitted to attend.
Yeah, and yet you deal with people face to face, so you're privy to their confidences.
Exactly, and we had attended the meetings successfully, and our attendance had been welcomed by Serco as a positive development. So there's still this attitude that wants to keep us at arm's length.
Understand.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just ask, up to now, the majority of those people at Brook House have been foreign national offenders. That's likely to change, given that the government are going to be detaining more people who are deemed to be here illegally, who may end up going to Rwanda on that scheme. Do you think the dynamics of Brook House is going to change? Because somebody who is an immigration detainee in immigration custody, for the most part, is a different sort of person to somebody who has served a sentence as with a criminal record, whatever that may be, and that includes some quite violent crimes that are being committed by people who are pending then being removed from the UK. Do you think that is that mix is a problem, or can they in any way run a two-type system within Brook House, or how can it actually work? It's not a prison, but it's become a detention centre for spent conviction and not spent conviction criminals, and for people who shouldn't be in the country but haven't committed a crime other than that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I think, what the evidence showed us at the inquiry was that actually we had witnesses, formerly detained people who were former prisoners, had served prison sentences, and they too told us about the distress that they found in Brook House as compared to a prison environment. And that was largely around the uncertainty and the lack of facilities, for want of a better expression. So actually that Brook House is built as to the specification of a Category B prison, but it doesn't have a lot of the things that another Category B prison who's going to hold people for a long time would have. So things such as, there's not sufficient outside space, there's not the access to the same things that you would have if you were serving a prison sentence. So actually, in some ways, I think it's almost akin to, if you think about police custody, and there are certain things that are acceptable in police custody, such as taking people's clothes or shoelaces or writing materials away from them, that you accept as okay because it's for a short period of time, and you wouldn't do once people are actually in prison, because there are different expectations about what's reasonable for the duration of time. And actually the regime at Brook House is such that it isn't equivalent to what you would find in a prison when somebody's serving a sentence. And so I would say that yes, I can see on the face of it, it seems that perhaps one or the other makes somewhere calmer or less calm. Actually, I think the mixture and the complexity of having people who perhaps have experience of being in custody, and then also people who have no experience of being in custody, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go one way or the other. I think what it means is you need a senior management team who are exceptionally vigilant to the risks that are presented by those different population groups living alongside each other. You need staff that fully understand the power dynamic between themselves and the detainees, and between different groups of detainees, and so that they are able to manage that in a way that reduces the risk to the most vulnerable people in that situation. So I don't think there's an easy solution to it, but I think ultimately it's about really robust senior management processes and really robust monitoring by the Home Office to ensure that that's being done in the way that it needs to be.
Thank you.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Kate, you mentioned in your open remarks that the took you 4 years to undertake the investigation, and I would imagine a great deal of money as well. And so how did it make you feel when the government responded by kind of sliding in their response in a written response, as opposed to provide an opportunity for MPs to scrutinise in the chamber?
I'll speak plainly, if I may. Essentially, yes, it took us just shy of 4 years to conduct the investigation. We don't yet have the exact final figure because we're in the process of doing the end-of-year financial reports, but it will be somewhere between 18 and 19 million pounds of public money that was spent. We obviously produced a very long and detailed report. We heard from lots of witnesses who found the experience itself very traumatising. I'm talking both about formerly detained people and members of staff and officials, that it's not an easy process to go through, giving evidence to a statutory inquiry. I think that the seriousness of the issues that I found, and given that the Home Office sets the terms of reference, which albeit I agree to, the Home Secretary at the time said that lessons needed to be learned from what had happened. We worked incredibly hard to make sure we met those very detailed and complex terms of reference. And I think the seriousness of what I found merited a far more detailed, robust, and ultimately accountable response. It's difficult for me, even knowing this inside out, to decipher exactly which of the 31 recommendations to government are being accepted or rejected. It's only really clear to me in 2 instances which are categorically being accepted or not. And I just think for a member of the public to not be able to understand what the outcome is of all that money and all that time, I think it's really disappointing.
So how confident are you then in terms of senior civil servants in the Home Office in being able to put in place actions that redress some of those issues that you've talked about in your report, in terms of, you mentioned Rule 34 and 35 and the fact that vulnerable people are still suffering inside Brook House?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of areas in the government response where there is just a restating of policy. And to my mind, I know what the policy is. I've looked at it. I know it inside out. And I took evidence about what the policy was for those 4 years. What the inquiry found is that the policy may be fine, but actually it's not being implemented in the way that it needs to be. And so if the outcome is not what it should be for those detained people, and likewise for staff who are having to deal with extremely complex individuals in very challenging environments, then that to me seems a disservice to what we've found as the inquiry. And so I have to say, I'm sorry and disappointed to say that I don't have confidence that actually there's been a meaningful engagement with what was really found and what these recommendations really mean, because I do fear that there will be it's very likely that there can be a repeat of these kind of things happening, because if you just reiterate the policy and don't get to grips with why the policy is not being implemented in the way that it needs to be, then why wouldn't it be being replicated in other parts of the estate? The other thing I would add to it is that we're at a point now, obviously at the moment, where we are very likely to have a drastic increase in the number of people being detained, at the same time as not having an independent chief inspector. So if there are pressures on the system as it is at the moment, and the policies and the rules are not being applied to protect the most vulnerable and to ensure that the rule of law is being upheld, then I'm very worried about what it looks like when more pressure is piled on that system.
Thanks, Kate. Anna, we had a very interesting visit to Brook House, some of us from the committee, a couple of weeks ago, subject to a bit of a PR exercise. But, for us, in the meeting with detainees and some of the staff was quite interesting, because they painted a very different picture. And a lot of some of the detainees weren't aware of the drop-in sessions that were being held for them to attend your support group sessions. And so I just wanted to know, how do you liaise with, the key staff within Brook House to make sure that that information is disseminated so people can access it?
We do have an excellent relationship with the welfare staff in the centre, and they refer people to us and spread word of the drop-in sessions. I think we also have signs up around the centre. Of course, it's an ever-fluctuating population, so if people aren't aware of our drop-in, that would lead me to question what the induction is like when people arrive in Brook House. There's meant to be a pack of information that they receive. They should be getting information about what's available in the centre in their own language. So that raised the question about the quality of the induction in the centre. Thank you for feeding that back.
Thanks, because I know that you do a great job, Anna. But what we also found was that some of the detainees were saying that they don't have contact with their caseworkers, don't know who their caseworkers are, and don't have regular contact, which, creates levels of anxiety because they don't know what's happening. And what would you say needs to improve to ensure that that relationship is better for the detainees?
Well, the report identified that a huge frustration and difficulty in the centre, Chair, is that that people have very limited knowledge about their case and contact with the Home Office. It's quite difficult for people to get a hearing from the Home Office in the centre, and people are informed about their case with a very brief document, a monthly progress report, which is often shamefully riven with errors, cut and paste so that information relates to different people, and gives very, very scant information about people's cases. And this is all they have. This is the only paper they have. It's not even in their own language to rely on to understand why they're detained. So many people have no clue why they're in detention in the first place. People's lawyers receive a much fuller document, a 10 or 12 page document that has a lot more detail. I mean, just common sense makes one wonder why that isn't available to detain people themselves. When we're in the NHS, we get full descriptions of analysis of our health conditions and what treatment is necessary and why. But if we're detained, if we're deprived of our liberty, we're given not even basic information as to what the decision is that has made that happen.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to follow up on a couple of the questions that have already been touched on around the sort of physical environment of Brook House, if I may. I was struck by a couple of the things in your report around the sort of physicality of the place and the impact on people's mental health, concerns over layout, concerns over whether there's adequate space for people who are kept there at the moment. You've already touched on the fact that there's an expectation there'll be a significant number of extra people resident there shortly, thanks to the Illegal Immigration Act, Illegal Migration Act 2023. Do you have any confidence that the proposed reforms by the government are going to enable those people to be housed safely and well, especially given, as Mr. Lawson's already touched on, there's going to be quite different demographic groups housed within Brook House? Ms. Eves, if I come to you first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. I think it's very difficult to know because we don't know what that accommodation is going to look like. I think my concern would be that if the accommodation makes it almost impossible to deliver what's required by Rule 3, which is maximum movement, a relaxed regime, then that in itself begins to erode the principle upon which you're kind of administratively detaining somebody. And that's what I found in the report was actually having this detrimental impact. So, if you've got heavy metal doors swinging shut, you've got the sound of the planes, you've got shouting, prison environments are loud because they're echoey, and it can feel oppressive. They feel oppressive. And so I think it's very difficult to answer the question in a meaningful way unless we know what those environments are going to look like. But what I would say is that the starting point has to be what the rules required is going to be delivered for those people, and whether that physical environment is actually capable of delivering it, because it doesn't matter how well then you staff it. If the physical environment itself makes it impossible to deliver that, then I think it's extremely difficult.
Thank you. That's really useful. And you mentioned staffing, and obviously this comes up time and again in your report again. Do you have any confidence that Brook House is turning a corner in terms of its ability to hang on to some of the trained staff it's got, but also to recruit new ones in, especially given the challenges that they're facing into at the moment?
I don't know the up-to-date figures on the staff retention issues, so I can't comment on that specifically. I think what we heard during the inquiry was that difficulty in essentially people understanding what the reality of the job entailed, so that they would have lots of people who went through the training, and at that point the only mandatory part of the training was the use of force, which I think in itself is really concerning, because it certainly doesn't seem to prioritise all of the other skills that I think staff need to have in those types of environments. But if you then have staff who complete their training and come onto the wings and are suddenly faced with the reality of what is expected of them and what is an extremely difficult, challenging environment to work in, then they were losing people very quickly, is what we were told by witnesses. So I think the two things potentially are related, that if you want to retain staff, then you need to make sure that you've got enough of them and that they are in the first place and that they're equipped and trained properly and that they are in an environment which allows them to deliver the things that you're asking them to deliver. I think one thing that perhaps I could add that would be helpful as the committee thinks about as things unfold with using additional accommodation is that ultimately it's the Home Office who have responsibility for humane and decent accommodation for people who are detained for administrative reasons. So if an increase in accommodation means an increase in contractors and providers, then to my mind that also needs to be paired with an increase in Home Office scrutiny and oversight to make sure that those contractors and those environments are really up to the job.
Thank you, and I will come back to that point. But if I just come to you, Ms. Pincus. So I know some of the training courses that new recruits are being put on are being updated at the moment. Do you have any insight as to, well, could you share your insight on whether you think those updated courses are sufficient? And what's your level of comfort that they're actually going to help the staff meet the challenges they're going to face as we see an influx of new people moving into Brook House?
I have to be honest and say I'm unsighted on the training that the Home Office offers to its staff. Going back to your previous question to Kate Eves, I would say that what we notice on the ground is that there's a great turnover of staff, and that this makes any interventions that the centre tries to make in changing the culture must make it very, very difficult to create change. Staffing is a huge issue, and I think that when you went to the centre you must have heard about difficulties of recruiting, in particular for healthcare, and this has severe impacts for people in detention.
And can I just bring you back to the physical environment again?
Yes.
So, it's a Category B prison environment.
Yes.
And we've heard, in previous evidence, and those committee members who attended the visit, saw in person the impact that can have on people.
Yes.
who are there at present. Do you have comfort that the facility is able to expand to house the number of people who are going to be coming through it in the future?
Facilities are definitely not adequate for holding large numbers of vulnerable people. It just doesn't work. So we know it doesn't work. When people are asked to share a cell, they will sometimes refuse. Now that sounds like they're being churlish, but in fact it's often a reflection of severe mental health problems. If you've experienced trauma, you may have nightmares. The only way you may be able to get through the night hours is having the television on or having the light on. If you're someone who's fled persecution because of your sexuality, you may be uncomfortable about talking with your partner when there's someone else in the room who may be homophobic. There's all sorts of reasons why shared space with no privacy is particularly difficult for people with severe mental health problems, people who often have difficulty accessing their medication that helps to enable them to function when they first arrive in the centre. So what happens to those people? I'll tell you what happens. They get put in isolation for not conforming to the request that's being asked of them. We supported one man. He refused to be in isolation due to his extreme mental health issues. He tried to hang himself while he was in detention. We asked 4 times for Rule 45.2, the mechanism that Kate mentioned, for him for his vulnerability to be assessed. Our emails were not replied to. Eventually, the Home Office offered him a Rule 35.2 at the point when they'd already decided to release him, but it took a further 5 months before he was released from detention. So this is the kind of situation we're getting. People put in segregation because they refuse to share a room. They refuse to share a room because they're very unwell. It's not a place for extremely vulnerable people to be held.
And can I ask, so that particular example there, and I'm sure there are multiple others similar, that occurred when the Chief Inspector was in place?
The person was released in March this year. I'm not sure of the dates of the Chief Inspectors.
I think it was early March.
Because the question I'm trying to get to, because obviously there is a route there for someone coming in, taking a view and escalating issues up to the Home Office and ultimately the Home Secretary. That route isn't available at present, and I'm keen to hear your views as to the risks that exposes, but also what other routes are available now without that Chief Inspector in place.
It's extremely difficult for there to be oversight at present. I mean, the IMB is the body, the Independent Monitoring Board is the body in the centre for whom it's brought to their attention every time someone is placed in segregation and every time an ACDT, which is the mechanism which monitors people who are at risk of harm. So a lot of pressure on them at the moment, but I'm sure they're under-resourced. They said during the inquiry it was difficult for them to meet the requirement to visit every person in segregation within 24 hours. They need more staff. I'm sure it's volunteer-led. They need people with specialist language skills. So how can a monitoring body like that really understand the severity of the problem if they can't speak to people in their first language and have access to interpreters?
And Mrs.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is really concerning because obviously that really key post being vacant means that there's a gap in what is a fundamental independent scrutiny of the detention estate. Obviously, there's still the Chief Inspector of Prisons, but their inspections are infrequent by design. That's not the purpose of what they're there for. I mean, what I would say is that certainly if I was a senior official in the Home Office, what I would want to be doing is comparing the rates of Rule 35 referrals across the detention estate and trying to understand why there might be a difference between, 100, theoretically 100 people on constant watch suicides or at the highest risk of suicide in a certain time period, but only 2 referrals under that specific branch of Rule 35. Why is that the case? Because it certainly seems to me that there should not be such a difference. And so I would want to understand, is it a problem in one place or at one time? Is it a problem across the entire estate? And what is the root cause of that? Because as at the risk of repeating myself, ultimately, this is the Home Office's responsibility. And so they need to be ensuring that the rules that are in place are being adhered to. And it seems to me that that's a routine part of checking the checks and balances across the estate and doing that comparative data.
That's incredibly helpful.
Thank you. Alison Hewless.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks very much for coming and giving evidence today. Some of the recommendations that you make, Kate, concern medical issues. So I wanted to pick up on some of the medical and health recommendations that you'd made. What's the extent to which you think the Home Office have responded to the various medical issues that people are facing within detention?
So in terms of looking at the recommendations that I've made around the specific problems with health, I think it's largely unclear what's being accepted, what's being rejected. In some cases, there is no information at all about what the response is. There's just a complete lack. So, for example, healthcare training, training of healthcare staff on the use of force. So I talked about the safeguarding responsibilities. There's one particularly concerning incident that we saw the footage of where a healthcare member of staff essentially watches what's happening, doesn't step in at any point, and there seemed to be a kind of wholesale misunderstanding or disregard for what their safeguarding responsibilities were. My concern is that there's too much of an alignment with the contractor or the Home Office perspective rather than being true to the professional clinical obligations on those individual members of staff, that you're safeguarding a patient. So I've made recommendations on a variety of things. That's just one of them, around them needing to understand what their responsibilities are. But we also had instances of fitness to fly letters being endorsed with a endorsement to use force, which, you know, I think is very difficult to understand why a clinician would endorse that. So there's specific information about that in the report. But more generally, I think I was really concerned by, and I know that previous reviewers and investigators have used the term a culture of disbelief, but I did see evidence of that an inclination to see distressed or erratic behaviour as a function of misbehaving or being disruptive, rather than as a function of deteriorating mental health, and so it being treated as a disciplinary issue rather than there needing to be a recognition that actually this person may need to be reviewed, certainly may not be appropriately held in detention, or may need a different type of input clinically. So I think there was a confluence of issues, and it's really concerning that none of those recommendations appear to have been directly addressed. So I just don't know what the response is going to be to them, if any.
That's interesting. And I noticed, so when we were taken on the visit of Brook House, and shown around and shown the medical facilities and so on, I noticed that there was a poster on the wall with the did not attend rate for February. Yep. And it said that there had been a quarter of the Rule 35 appointments had not attended those appointments. 41% hadn't attended a GP appointment, 23% of nurse appointments hadn't attended. Have you any kind of thoughts as to why that might be the case?
So again, we did cover this in some detail in the report. So I think we identified that there was a real issue with almost a catch-22, I suppose. If you've got somebody who is in such a position that their mental health is suffering, that the need to ensure that they're attending appointments and not having any process whereby you identify somebody who's continually missing appointments for assessment, that doesn't seem good enough to me. That if you've got people that the very reason for them needing to be seen is that they are suffering, and that there is a potential clinical cause of that you need to then identify appropriate mechanisms to get them in front, or to understand why they're not appearing for those appointments. And I think, again, we talk in the report about a lack of understanding on the part of detainees about exactly what the Rule 34 and 35 process is about, and so not understanding how important it is in terms of potentially reviewing their ongoing detention, and why those two rules need to work so closely together to ensure that they do understand the importance of attending those meetings.
Yeah, because it seemed quite odd to me that if you or I perhaps didn't turn up to our GP appointment, the GP is not going to come out to our house, but you know where these folk are that aren't attending the appointments. Would you expect there to be follow-up if people didn't attend? And do you have any evidence that happens?
Yes, I think, I'm not unrealistic about the fact that there's often, staffing shortages, and so there's pressure on staff, and that I suspect it's easy for things like that to slip when you don't have the right number of staff to be fulfilling all of the roles you need to. But to my mind, that's not good enough. You need to have the right number of staff, and you need to ensure that you're getting people who are at risk of deterioration to the appointments that have been scheduled, because they won't have been scheduled for no reason. There will have been an indication that was necessary. Yeah.
Anna, have you got any kind of feedback on that kind of thing from the people that you meet?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the Rule 34 is particularly interesting to know. I know there was some medical justice research recently that showed out of 66 people, only 35 had had a Rule 34. And that was because a lot of people had refused one. But I think, as Katie says, that's a case of the purpose of it not being explained, and not being explained in their first language. The way that Brook House functions is kind of arbitrary. Like, some things work well sometimes, and other things just collapse sometimes. And there are basic elements of communication that fail regularly, and communication between healthcare and detained people is one of those areas. As Kate Eves says, that's partly about the level of vulnerability. But then we meet people who've been requesting an appointment with a psychiatrist for many months, and then the next time they go and ask, they're told, oh, well, you had an appointment, but you didn't turn up. But they weren't aware that there was an appointment. Yeah. So it's just these kind of basic breakdowns in communication, which are signifiers, they're indications that things aren't working well.
On a very practical level, I noticed there's very few clocks in the building as well, so it makes it more difficult to attend an appointment if you don't know what the time is.
Yeah, interesting. I noticed that.
Do you feel that people are being appropriately assessed when they arrive? Do they understand the process at that stage?
I think the pre-screening is an issue even before people arrive. So some people who've already won cases for unlawful detention are then being re-detained when there's been no discernible changes in their circumstances. So even before detention, the assessments are poor. When people arrive, they're entitled to see a nurse and then a doctor within 24 hours, and those assessments are very, very short. I think 10 minutes. It's not long enough to assess someone's physical and mental health when it's someone who will be distressed, who you'll need to build trust with before they can start to give you any meaningful answers, and who will be conversing with you not in their first language. So it's very unsatisfactory. And once an initial assessment is made, there doesn't seem to be any appreciation that assessments need to be dynamic. So they need to be open to be made again and again, because people get bad news, people spiral down, people who've experienced trauma in the past experience being re-detained as a trigger for post-traumatic stress. There are many, many reasons why the decisions that are taken about people need to be revisited.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And do you think, given the announcement earlier on this week about more people being detained or being removed as part of the Rwanda plan, do you think that that's likely to get worse? I'm aware of a case of somebody being detained in Glasgow and taken almost straight away down to a detention centre. Is there going to be time within that process to even assess people?
My concern about what will happen with the changes that are coming down our way at Brook House are evidenced by what's happened in the past. So towards the end of 2020, there were rapid removals before Brexit, and we saw high levels of self-harm, high levels of suicidal ideation, high levels of people on hunger strike. At that time, the IMB said that detention was inhumane, and the centre was struggling. Centre staff were also struggling to manage people in their care. In 2022, with the first flights to Rwanda, there were more issues. Those were largely issues of lack of information and lack of access to legal firms. And the situation with access to lawyers in the centre has worsened since then, not just because it's hard to find lawyers with capacity to take cases, but also because recently it was introduced that legal advice could be on the telephone for detained people. So, I mean, you can imagine what that means. People end a phone call having no idea who the lawyer was or what the firm was, with no written advice. The lawyer is unable to assess the vulnerability of the person in a phone call and isn't able to look at documents that the person might have brought to the consultation. Those then have to be faxed afterwards. The fax may not be working. It just builds delays into their contact. So, yeah, we have concerns about. That's even before you think of the failure of safeguards, the wholesale failure of safeguards that the inquiry report was so clear about. So you're adding people into a system that's already struggling, and we've seen evidence before of what that means on the ground. It must be very difficult for centre staff to cope with.
Yeah, thank you. And the last thing I just wanted to ask, when we met with people that were currently detained, It seemed to me from a lot of their stories that they didn't actually need to be there. Some of them who weren't going to be removed were awaiting removal back to accommodation somewhere else, and that was a bit of a logjam to the system. Do you hear that from the people that you meet with?
So often. And we run a walking project where we go on walks with people after detention. And several years after people have been released from detention, they'll still be revisiting, why did that happen to me? Why was I held? And you almost want to say, leave it behind, it's in the past. But the sense of injustice of it, of being taken away from your family, your community, your support mechanisms, placed into a situation where detention is indefinite, with the terrible harms that does to people. There's something about human beings where we need to understand the parameters. People say being detained is worse than being in prison because they can't count down the days to their release. So if you're doing that to people for no reason, because you're releasing them back to the community, just wonder why we're causing people so much harm. I think there was a statistic in the HMIP report in 2022 that 67% of people at that point were being released back into the UK. So you're depriving people of their liberty, causing them the harm of the uncertainty of indefinite detention, and then just putting them back where they were.
Yeah, well, that's quite frustrating. I think from the figure that I noted down on the visit, there was about 70 people in the detention estates that were waiting to leave it. And that seems pretty ridiculous, really. Thank you, Chair.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Now, Anna, the way you described the situation with segregation and everything that's been used as a weapon or a tool to stop people being problematic, as it were, tells me that the biggest problem in there is mental health. The biggest health problem is obviously mental health. Is there a formal process? Are there in-house staff who are trained nurses? Do they have psych visits? I mean, you said it was a very quick assessment, but what is the ongoing process for assessing someone's mental health, their potential danger to themselves, potential danger to others? What is the process?
It's very opaque. And I think the mental health lead, that there's been a problem recruiting one recently. People ask for assessments, lawyers ask for assessments, and they're not successful in getting them. You're right, mental health is a huge issue. I think, again, the HMIP report, they said 80% of people were depressed. And being in indefinite detention in the architecture of Brook House causes harm. Yeah. So even if people were functioning before they were detained, very often, because of their histories of trauma, the experience of being in Brook House makes life impossible.
So there's no formal, Kate, there is no formal setup. There isn't a mental health nurse, there's not a psychologist that goes in, there's no opportunity for people to talk to someone about their mental health, or nothing at all.
Well, so what we found in the inquiry is that at times there may well have been a mental health nurse on shift. It wasn't always guaranteed. There certainly isn't the same provision as you might expect to see. You know, there isn't kind of an on-site psychologist and the ability to run the kind of things which perhaps are the most needed, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, how to kind of deal with that for those individuals. I think it's really important as well to recognise that a lot of the time medical staff will need discipline staff, as they're often called. They'll need the officers, the detention staff, to identify somebody as being at a need of having an assessment. And what was shown time and time again in the evidence of the inquiry is that the staff did just not understand how mental health might manifest itself. So they too saw erratic, irrational, difficult behaviour as being a manifestation of just being difficult and disruptive.
Did they not understand, or were they not trained?
I think both. They certainly didn't have the training, and even surprisingly at more senior levels, people admitted that they just didn't understand what the difference was between somebody acting up or somebody genuinely being in distress or experiencing some sort of mental ill health. So I think, in fairness to clinical staff, they're reliant to a degree on the information that flows through to them. But again, I made a recommendation about a raft of training for staff, which included things such as understanding mental health indicators and also a recommendation about communicating between medical and non-medical staff, and it's just not clear whether those recommendations are going to be addressed in any way. So it's a worrying picture, because there are clearly very high levels of mental ill health.
And Anna, you mentioned staff retention, and you mentioned high turnover, and you just mentioned the fact they couldn't actually advertise for mental health staff, but they couldn't get one. Why is there such a high turnover? Should I suggest that maybe they don't pay sufficient money to attract people to these posts?
Well, interestingly, that is anecdotal evidence that overtime isn't high enough paid. That's just from staff chatting in the corridor, though. But obviously the detention centre's right next to the airport, so maybe it's easier to work in the airport than it is to work with a high percentage of vulnerable and traumatised people who are being incarcerated, and yeah, you can imagine it's difficult work.
Yeah, so stressful. But people are leaving to go where? Do we know what the biggest attraction for them outside of Brook House is? What kinds of jobs are they going into?
I think people probably go to take other security jobs, maybe in the airport. Because the centre is next to Gatwick Airport, and the airport is a major employer of people in the area.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just ask a couple of questions about the detention period? Because I know the recommendation that you made around setting a detention period limit was rejected, and the government said that would significantly impair the ability to remove those who refuse to leave the UK voluntarily. I wondered if you could just say something about that, because I noted that we are very much out of kilter in this country by not having a limit on detention. So would you like to comment on why that is?
It's something that frequently came up during the inquiry, that the issue of the indefinite, indeterminate amount of time that somebody may spend there as being a profound cause of distress. And that's both amongst people who had no experience of a custodial environment and people who had plenty of experience of a custodial environment and were able to kind of compare the two. So yes, as Ms Pincus mentioned, that, you know, counting down the days until release, and you just can't do that, the uncertainty. It's interesting, I suppose, and I think particularly interesting when you look at the data that, again, Ms Pincus mentioned about what HMIP found about the number of people that are actually being released rather than being deported from detention. So, I mean, I would think certainly the committee, I'm sure, is interested to understand the cost dynamics of what that looks like, why as a nation we detain without time limit, what the reasons are for that. I'm certainly not the first commentator on this issue to suggest 28 days, and I don't think there's any secret to the fact there is no, there's no magic to the 28-day number. I think it's a reasonable time frame. I think with the new legislation, the fact that it's actually that I think there is the potential for the time to lengthen because of things such as a second medical opinion in the adults at risk guidance, for example. So I think it does really concern me, because there seemed to be a direct correlation between the issues that I found at Brook House and that lack of certainty and the indeterminate nature. I think it's also fair to say that from a staff perspective as well, that it's very difficult for staff to engage in the same way with a population who is transient but unpredictably transient, as it would be in a prison population where you know more about the people that you're going to have there and what they're working towards and those kind of things. So I do think that forms part of why there can be such a negative culture, negative staff culture, because it's very difficult for them to build up those type of relationships. And that's in no way an excuse, but I think there needs to be a recognition that builds in another risk factor when you're talking about environments like this, and a lack of end date to how long people can be there for.
Is there an alternative that could be used? I mean, what is the alternative if you say it's 28 days that you can only hold somebody? The government are obviously concerned about making sure they've got the ability to remove people. What would you suggest how you sort that out?
I think, and obviously because the inquiry looked at this specific environment, which is the Cat B prison type environment, I think it must be, whatever your views are about the rights and wrongs of detaining different types of people, there must be an option that involves a different form of detention, which doesn't look and feel and sound and smell like a prison. That they're very expensive places to run and staff, and to my mind, unless there are very specific reasons why it's necessary from a safety perspective, which the data perhaps suggests if upwards of 60% of people are being re-released into the community, that is not the case for those individuals, then it seems to me that there needs to be a wholesale reconsideration of the type of environments that we're using to detain people. Because if it's not possible to keep it to 28 days, then we shouldn't be using environments that are only suitable for that very short period of time.
Okay. I also just wanted to ask you about the independent scrutiny of Brook House, and we've obviously heard about HMIP and the Independent Monitoring Board. Do you think the combination of those two are adequate in holding the Home Office, who you've said several times are ultimately responsible for this, accountable for the implementation of your recommendations?
Well, I think it's very difficult for them to do that, given that we ourselves don't know which of the recommendations, if any, are going to be implemented. So I think they're starting from a very difficult position to know. I think it's also really important, and the report reflects this in detail, to recognise that external oversight is a really important complementary form of scrutiny, but these are conditions of detention that ultimately the government department has responsibility for. So I think absolutely the IMB and HMIP play a very important role. I also think the Independent Chief Inspector plays a very different but equally important role in looking at the processes more broadly. So I think what concerned me throughout the inquiry was that there was too much reliance on those forms of oversight and not enough professional scepticism, perhaps, about the fact that contracts a lot of the time rely on self-reporting. So if G4S or Circle or any other contract provider chooses to report in a way which perhaps can disguise some of the shortcomings of what's happening at a centre, then again, if I was a very senior official in the Home Office, I would want to have in place a system that probed that and could look beneath the figures to make sure that we really were getting what we thought we were getting.
So this cross-government working group that's been established, do you think that that's going to be effective in monitoring what's going on?
I think the lack of scrutiny concerns me. I think my understanding is that it's chaired by a senior policy official within the Home Office itself. I think it's difficult to see that the broad range of stakeholders and core participants and people that are interested in the outcome of the inquiry are likely to feel rightly or wrongly, they're not likely to feel a huge amount of confidence in it not being somebody independent who's looking at the recommendations and whether or not they're being responded to. So I think the lack of scrutiny is an issue because, as I say, we don't know which of the recommendations are going to be followed. So I hope that you as a committee will continue to show a great deal of interest in this. I think it's going to be only more and more important as more people are potentially detained, and we perhaps see a broader spread of contractors providing that service.
And I noted when you spoke to the Lords Committee, Statutory Inquiries Committee, you made the very generous and kind offer to come back at a 6-month point, free of charge, to look at the response to your recommendations and talk through any issues.
I was not taken up on that offer, and the offer still stands. I think as I said to the Lords Committee, I think one of the things that concerns me the most about the process of a statutory inquiry is the inability to find out exactly what's going to happen at the end of it. So you spend a huge amount of public money, you take a lot of time, you take a lot of evidence, and if at the end of it a member of the public can't understand what actually came out as a result, I think that's really problematic. And so my offer still stands. I'm very happy to assist in any way I can in making sure the recommendations are fully understood and doing whatever I can to ensure that they're implemented in a way that addresses many of the issues that I found.
Right. It is very concerning that you as the chair cannot fathom which of the recommendations have been accepted, being implemented, progress. I mean, that is a real concern. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the committee finally, but both of you, that you haven't been able to say or you feel that we've not questioned you enough on? Anything you want to say?
I'd just like to mention, as follow-up to your question about alternatives to detention, that there have been 2 alternative to detention pilots, one of which has been reported on by UNHCR, that involve people in the community, supported holistically, made connections with medics, and also to get advice on their immigration case. And the outcome of that is that people are less likely to abscond, are more likely to follow due process because they feel that they've been heard, and that their cases have been heard swiftly and fairly, and it is important to always bear in mind that detention in a place like Brook House is not the only way.
Right, okay, that's very helpful, thank you.
Yeah, and I think I would probably just end by saying that, you know, we obviously talk about detention broadly, but I think it's really important to think about the additional things that can happen once people are in detention, and that kind of using force against people. And, you know, it's not easy viewing, but I really would urge the committee to look at some of the footage of what that actually looks like in practice, because I think it's really important to recognise that when force is being used, what that actually means to the individual and to the staff who are doing it. So I think I would just kind of re-emphasise that once people are there and detained, there are lots of other things that happen, be that using force on them, be that segregating them. And I think we need to remember that Parliament put in place these rules to protect people because of those really quite profound powers, and it should not be for individual contractors or members of staff to choose whether or not they follow those rules.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you for coming along today, and I'm sure the Select Committee during the course of this Parliament and hopefully in the next Parliament will want to look and see what is actually happening with the recommendations that you made in your very thorough report. And thank you for all your work, and thank you also, Anna, to you and all your colleagues for all the work that you do too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.